Moment of housekeeping, if you could all please put your phones on silent so that we can hear each other's contributions today. Thank you. So good morning everyone, and a big welcome. Welcome to the India International Centre for this very special event, a high-level panel discussion to mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. My name's Darren Farrand and I'm Director of the UN Information Centre here in New Delhi. It's my honour to MC today's discussions. I would first like to thank our esteemed hosts, the IIC, for their support and hosting. As you know, today's discussion is entitled The UN at 80, Reflections and Visions for the Future. It reflects the UN's commitment to a robust and serious inquiry and debate around how it works, how it operates, and how it should operate in the future. And so it can better meet the needs of future challenges and future generations. And for our discussion today, we have four very distinguished speakers. I'll just announce them in alphabetical order. Mr. Nitin Desai, former UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj, former Indian Permanent Representative to the UN in New York. General Satish Nambiar, former Force Commander and Head of Mission, UN Protection Force in the former Yugoslavia, or UNPROFOR. And Priya, Youth Advocate and member of UR India's Young People's Action Team. And their conversation will be moderated by Shombi Sharp, the UN Resident Coordinator here in India. But before we turn to all of that, I'm going to first introduce a short film, a short video about the work of the United Nations here in India. Some of you may have seen it before, but I think it's worth watching. So if we start to roll the screen, as it were, we'll be seeing a little bit of the UN in action.
In India, land of a billion stories, there is another one waiting to be told. The United Nations and India have been a part of each other's story from the very start.
Draft Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Even before its own independence, India was one of the UN's founders. Since 1945, the UN and India have stood united, partners in progress. Towards a healthy future for all. Good nutrition, inclusive education, decent and fair work, a more sustainable planet, empowering the vulnerable. Together, we've also shared India's story with the wider world. The journey continues. Our destiny is entwined. The UN and India are working together, driving change, building peace, rooting out injustice, strengthening communities, leaving no one behind.
The honour to invite KN Srivastava, Director of the IIC, to say a few words to us. Thank you.
Mr. Sombi Saap, General Satish Nambiar, my colleague Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a matter of great honor for India International Center and all of us that UN has chosen to conduct this program at IIC. For this, I would like to really thank Mr. Sombi Saap for taking the initiative. As was mentioned in the film, India, when this UN came into existence in 1945, was not an independent country. And even the person who represented India was not the true representative of India, Mr. Ramaswamy Mudaliar. He was basically nominated by the then Governor General. Congress who was spearheading the freedom movement, was wanting to have somebody nominated by it, but that was not allowed. Anyway, that's a past history. Ever since UN has come into existence, India has always played a very constructive part in the affairs of UN. As we all know, the basic mandate for the United Nations is one, to maintain world peace, and the second is to see that all the countries, they develop together and there is amity, understanding and fraternity among them. I'm very happy that United Nations has really worked sincerely in that direction, and there are several accolades which one would like to give to United Nations for the work they have done. The structure of United Nations, of course, indicates that there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The very idea of having 5 permanent members was perhaps that these members will always provide proactive support of all kinds to the United Nations. Because without their support, United Nations may have difficulty in carrying out its programs. It has worked very well. But later years, we are finding that that spirit has started little, withering out, which is creating a lot of problems. The members of the Security Council have to really go beyond their self-interest. They have to really see the whole world as their own, and with that spirit only they should, work. I'm quite sure the conversation which is going to follow now will be deliberating on this aspect as well as on many other important aspects. Today, what we are finding is that the world is highly, highly volatile, insecure. The unending war between Ukraine and Russia is just going on and on. One doesn't know when it is going to end. Israel-Hamas conflict, though supposed to have ended, but still skirmishes are taking place. More than 65,000 people have lost their lives. Pakistan-Afghanistan war is now simmering. Now, what we are finding is that in all these situations, the kind of visibility which UN should have had is just missing. Perhaps one should not blame UN. There are many regions which should make the individual nations to introspect as to where they are lacking in really activizing UN. And if there is anything lacking on the part of the UN, on the part of the individual countries, they should really make good those things so that the UN really plays its legitimate part for which it has been created. And all these years, it has been actually doing so. Another aspect which I like to cover is the environment aspect. Now, everyone knows that is global warming is now creating havoc in day-to-day life. The climates all over the globe have started changing. And if immediate corrective actions are not taken, then of course, disaster and all kinds of problems, the humanity, even the survival of humanity is going to be in question. But one was very hopeful after the COP met in Kyoto. A clear-cut, action plan was drawn in, and one was expecting that all countries, they will be really working for implementing those things. But then the Paris situation became entirely different, and today the whole thing is in the state of flux. Now, here again, UN's role is very, very important, and all countries have to cooperate with UN. Then only this kind of things can succeed. Here in IISc, the erstwhile Secretary General of UN, Ban Ki-moon, he had come and he released the GG report on India relating to how India can, achieve zero emission target. So UN and through its other agencies and NGOs has been playing very constructive part. But as I mentioned earlier, UN can succeed only if all nations wholeheartedly cooperate. Non-cooperation we saw during the period of COVID, where the sharing of information amongst the countries did not take place in time, and consequently the whole globe suffered. So COVID has given us a message that international cooperation, the importance of UN is so very important that no country should ever try to undermine its role and authority and importance. The world trade is another cause of great concern. When WTO was set up, one thought that now things are going to move in a particular manner. But today we are finding that the whole globe international trade is disrupted. Some countries may temporarily benefit in the short term, but in long term, without international cooperation, without institutions like WTA, the globe cannot really develop and develop collectively. I would not like to take more time of yours because you are going to discuss definitely all these issues I've raised and many more issues. I'd only like to say that now the time has come when the composition of Security Council must be really re-looked into. Many countries, like India, as I mentioned, was not an independent country then. Now India has not only become a very important country. Today, our economy is going at the fastest pace. We are soon going to become third largest economy. In terms of population, we are now the biggest. So this aspect must reflect in the composition of the Security Council. Finally, I'll just end that so far we in India are concerned, we have always been guided by our ancient philosophy and wisdom, that is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We treat the whole world as our family. And that spirit is the real, true spirit of the United Nations. So with these few words, I once again welcome each one of you, and I really look forward to really very constructive and fruitful outcomes from this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Srivastava. And now, without any further ado, I would like to invite Shombi and our four panelists onto the stage to begin the panel discussion. Please.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for joining us today. On behalf of the United Nations team and family here in India, many of whom are here in the room, Aap sab se milkar bahut acha laga. It's really a great mix of diplomats, of government of India, of young people here in the room. So it's really wonderful to see all of you on a gray Thursday morning. Thank you for making it. This is, of course, the 80th anniversary year of the United Nations. That is what is bringing us together here today. We celebrated the UN Day, actually, on Friday. We had an absolutely wonderful unveiling launch of a UN 80th stamp by the government of India. And the Honorable External Affairs Minister hosted. Many, I think, were there in that room as well. We had also a UN Day celebration of partnerships at UN House, just across the road here. So I think it's not too late still to wish everybody here Aap sabhi ko Sanyut Rashtra Divas ki hardik shubhkamnaएं. It's really part of the ongoing year. So this is a milestone year. Again, 80 years of the UN, 10 years of the Sustainable Development Goals, and really marking an achievement that few human institutions have achieved, which is longevity over decades. And of course, as we have heard, the UN, the very concept of multilateralism, of countries coming together for collective solutions to common challenges, was born principally out of the ashes of the Second World War, with the slogan, never, never again. But understanding that it cannot just be wished for, that peace and prosperity has to be built, and understanding the confluences between peace and security. Human rights, development. We've added the concepts of humanitarianism, of counterterrorism, of many different aspects being built out. And of course, the world was very, very different when all of this was started. We had just about 2.5 billion people. Now we have over 8 billion people. The number of member states, the democracy in the world has grown tremendously, as was mentioned. Concepts of the challenges that we face have transitioned from not only mushroom clouds, but now we are very worried about melting ice caps, from peacekeeping in the Balkans to policymaking in cyberspace. And even now as we speak, Hurricane Melissa is devastating the Caribbean. So we're seeing the impacts of hurricane force that hasn't been seen yet this year. And so we're seeing the impacts across the board. And exactly at the moment in time then when one would think we should be coming together more than ever, when we need Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam more than ever, this very moment, multilateralism working together is under threat like never before. One sees perhaps unhappy parallels to the period which led to the creation of the UN, the interwar years. Have we seen this movie before? Trade barriers are rising. Barriers to human mobility are rising. Countries are some are choosing to, and others are being forced to go it alone, so to speak. And the very real challenges in peace and security, the lack of reform in the UN Security Council, for example, which comes first to mind, and is perhaps, I could say, there is no greater proponent for UN Security Council reform than the Secretary General himself. But that is the prerogative of the member states, not the institution. And that often overshadows the incredible and important work being carried out by UN colleagues and partners, often at peril, some losing their lives. In terms of humanitarian support, development support, it's easy to forget that the UN is helping to protect something like 140 million people forced to flee their homes from conflict and persecution. providing food assistance to almost 130 million people in the world, helping supply vaccines to something like 45% of the world's children, saving millions of lives each and every year. Peacekeeping operations, which we will get to, and still delivering important global treaties. Very recently, the High Seas Treaty, UNFCCC in Paris, for all of its faults. Can you imagine if we didn't have that? Where would we be going? So I think, finally, it's so very relevant to be having this conversation here and now in India, because India, as we've heard, has been such a pillar of support, of leadership in the United Nations since the very beginning, and continues to be so, and I would argue in the given geopolitical turn, emerges as a vital pillar of stability even more than ever. Leading in peacekeeping since the very beginning, the greatest contributing country to troops, leading voice for the Global South, for climate justice, counterterrorism, and many other issues. And we in the UN here are so proud to be humble partners of this incredible India development story, digital public infrastructure, food security, private sector, AI, you name it. And we saw in the film many of those aspects. So it's enough from me, because of course we are here for this truly all-star panel, which has already been introduced and probably really didn't need introduction in the first place. But it's really an honor and a privilege to be here on stage with all of you. And with that, I think let me start with a legend in the halls of the United Nations, Mr. Nitin Desai, to my left, who I can say it's really remarkable when you look at your experience and how you've helped shape many of the UN's greatest achievements in these global summits that have led to thinking at the global level that it's easy to take for granted now, that it wasn't always that way. From Rio to Johannesburg and others. Looking back, could I ask you, sir, what would you, in your view, have been the UN's most important achievements? What makes them endure, and what do you think needs to change moving forward to stay relevant at this time of perhaps existential pressure?
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for organizing this meeting. And I'll be speaking more as a former UN person rather than as an Indian. And I would say the first thing I would stress to everybody is the UN is not a governance of the world. It is a collection of countries, an amalgam countries meeting together. It's the sort of thing you will get when you have in a village, the villagers meeting, in a residential area, the residents meeting, or in a town hall. And in many ways, I used to argue with the Secretary General then that you are the spokesman, you're a community leader. You're not the governor of the world. You're a community leader, and your success is the extent to which you can articulate the expression of the majority, the vast majority of the community. That has happened. You're seeing it again and again with the Secretary General. Not all of them, but certainly the present Secretary General is a very good spokesperson for what I would describe as a community sentiment. And in many ways, this is what the UN has achieved. Its greatest success is it has given a voice to small countries which otherwise would not have any influence. Would otherwise not have any. The big countries, the Americas, the USAs, etc., would always have influence. But the small countries are the ones who have wielded that, used the UN in many ways. And I'm very happy that India, despite being a large country, has always been one who's been willing to use the UN to articulate its basic principles. And that is the second point. the extent to which the UN has been an articulator of principles of peace, which have not been very effective, I agree, principles about humanitarian relief, principles about cooperation between countries on issues which involve people. I think in many ways that dimension of what the UN has done is one of the points that I would stress and emphasize, and that we have been reasonably effective. And the UN is essentially the space where you get things which you get which you would expect to get from a town hall meeting or a village meeting or a residence meeting. But it is not the country, not the unit which is actually controlling what happens, always. And one of the things that I would argue is that one of the things we did try and do was to see how we can extend the influence of the UN on the international entities like the World Bank, the IMF, and others, who are capable of implementing things. I'm not sure we always have fully succeeded, but I certainly know that to some extent on sustainable development we did. By the time I was there, by the end of the 90s, the head of the IMF and the head of the World Bank kept on saying how their job is to promote sustainable development, and they even started articulating the goals that the UN had got agreement on amongst countries. And this is reflected now in something very useful, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were finalized in 2015, and which I notice is being taken seriously by every country. There is a way in which now I can compare what India is achieving with what, say, China is achieving, because both of them are focusing on evaluating their effectiveness in implementing sustainable development goals. So to some extent, that second part I was talking about, of the UN's process having an impact on what actually happens at the ground level, is, I think, moving a little bit forward. Now, it's true that in many ways, though the UN is an organization of all countries, there is a certain power which the large countries, the powerful countries, wield in the UN. That cannot be ignored. One of the reasons why we did well in the 90s was that the great divisions that we had in the UN between, say, Soviet Union and the United States disappeared with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. The Cold War had collapsed. China was being very quiet and peaceful. And when we were working in the 90s with the great conferences, we did not have great difficulty. And even the developing countries had moved a little closer to the sort of things which the developed countries believed in terms of economic policy, etc. And even the social policy, it was possible to do that. We could have a meeting on women. We could have a meeting on social development, a summit, which was impossible before 1990. So in many ways, those 90s is a very special period. The regrettable feature is that since then, that has not prevailed. We are back in a world where there is conflict between the great powers. My argument would be to the UN to continue what you have always been able to do, which is to be a voice for the widely believed beliefs in what needs to be done. And yes, you will be criticized by somebody in Washington, somebody in Beijing, somebody elsewhere, but persist in that, because that has been your strength. And in many ways, when you look ahead as to what the future of the UN is, I think the future of the UN is it must continue to articulate this common belief of a large number of countries, out of all, as many as possible of 193, and not be dominated by what are the views, essentially, of the big, great powers, and so on. This is what the UN is really contributing. We have not had this in the past, but we now have it, and I think this is what it should continue to do. So, yes, there are many dimensions of what you could read in the preamble to the UN which have not been fully achieved, but there are many things which have been achieved. or have been moved, at least the world has been able to move forward. So my feeling is that the UN must work as a community center. What you expect from that we articulate in expressing the views of the mass of people in the world, and not the views of one or two countries here and there. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that was that was extremely insightful. Thank you for that. And we will be coming back in a bit. Now it's my honor and pleasure, Ambassador Ruchir Kamboj, to move the conversation to your experience. I think it was Otto von Bismarck who's kind of attributed with the witticism that laws are like sausages; they're better not to be witnessed being made. And I guess at the multilateral level, probably one could also say the same. You've seen the UN from the front lines in New York, at the Security Council, through some of India's most active years of engagement. If I could ask you for your views on similar lines, where have you seen the institution really making a difference? And where do you feel that the institution needs to change to remain effective and relevant? Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Shambi. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. As to your question, firstly, I would like to say I agree fully with what the former Under-Secretary General has mentioned. But I think the UN has had so many successes. It's just that they've receded to the background, and therefore no one talks about them. And what one really talks about is the peace and security agenda, where admittedly there has been some failure. But then if you really look at the question closely, what is the United Nations? What is the United Nations? It's just the member states. And if the member states are not agreeing amongst themselves, what can the UN do? And I think that links with the point that you've just made. But let me talk about the successes of the United Nations, because not many people talk about the successes, particularly today. Let me take you back to 1980 and the eradication of smallpox. I think that was remarkable, and as far as I know, it is the only human disease that has been completely wiped out. And we all recall that the UN led from the front, the WHO. So that was truly extraordinary. And then when we talk about climate, which is so much more relevant today, let's talk about the Montreal Protocol of 1987 and the healing of the ozone layer. Now, I think that protocol is probably one of the most successful environment and climate agreements. And the extraordinary fact is that it was ratified by all 193 countries. Amazing. And if I am informed correctly, I am told that by the middle of this century, by 2040 or 2050, the ozone layer would have healed completely, which in its own way would contribute to a reduction of global warming. Extraordinary, but nobody talks about that. Then let's talk about the law of the sea. The UN made the law of the sea, which, by the way, protects 2/3 of this planet. And how about the telecom arm of the United Nations, which is the ITU, or the International Telecommunications Union? Well, because of its quiet work, its slow and steady work, you have planes, you have ships, you have satellites orbiting without talking over each other. I don't think any of us talk about these successes, and there are so many more. There's also the UN Statistical Commission, which has done remarkable work, and because of which all the member states in the globe today have common standards. So there is excellent and outstanding work that the United Nations has done, but unfortunately we don't talk much about it. As to the second part of your question, Shambi, as to what can be done to change the United Nations system, I think a lot can be done, but I will focus on 3 or 4 pressure points. I think the first pressure point, very clear, is that the UN Security Council needs to be reformed. It has been said, but it needs to be said again. And why do I say that? Simply because the Global South is not on the table. And the Global South needs to be on the table to bring that greater diversity of voices, that greater democracy of voices on the table, so that quite simply decision-making can be more legitimate and frankly more effective. I think the second point that I would definitely look at very closely is the question of resources. I think the UN needs to be funded. There has to be regular funding to the United Nations. We've heard of so many humanitarian organizations. They don't have the resources to match their mandate. Let's not forget peacekeeping, same problem. You have mandates, you have no resources. So how can you do more with less? That's the question to all of you. I don't believe it's possible. And the third area where I think we can do a lot is to modernize peacekeeping. I think the peacekeeping that was built in the 1960s, that was a very different era. As all of us know, there had to be a ceasefire first, and then the host government invited the peacekeepers. But today the scenario has completely changed. There are so many actors. And the terrain has become so much more dangerous, and all of us here sitting know that very often today peacekeepers don't necessarily enter a country with strong consent. Look at the case of Mali in 2023, when that mission wound up. The Malian government asked for the peacekeepers to leave. I was there. But I don't believe it was a failure of UN peacekeeping. It wasn't a failure of the UN peacekeepers. No, it's simply a way of saying that modern conflicts cannot be solved by an old peacekeeping. So you need to modernize peacekeeping. I would do that if that was in my hands. And what would I do? I would make use of more digital technologies. I would use drones for surveillance. I would do digital mapping across borders. I would ensure cybersecurity for civilians, keeping the hospitals and all the other infrastructure safe. And I think these are very, very important areas. The last area where I think you can improve peacekeeping is that you should be able to fund smarter in the United Nations, across the United Nations system. For heaven's sake, you don't have to wait for a crisis and then you start moving files. It doesn't work like that. The emergency and the crisis is over. You have to have a trigger within the system, a trigger whereby immediately as the crisis starts, the money is there. So Shombi, I'll stop there. There's so much more that can be said, but I think there are others who have some very valuable points also to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think that was very well put and very well received, and in fact a great segue to General Nambiar, ending with the peacekeeping. I had the opportunity to sit down with Major Radhika Sen, the Indian peacekeeper who received an award from the Secretary General last year, and just a perfect exemplification of India's leadership in peacekeeping, not just generally in terms of being the largest contributor of men and women since the beginning, but also being a force for bringing in women in peace and security, and Security Council 1325 being a leader in that as well. And I would also say my very first interaction with UN peacekeeping was in Lebanon some years ago, about a decade ago, and I had the opportunity. We were looking at bringing in development projects to match with the peacekeeping forces, to provide opportunities for communities where the peacekeepers were to build brighter futures. And flew in the helicopter up into the hills and met with a battalion. At that time, I didn't realize this personal significance, but it was the Indian battalion, INBAT. And so my very first engagement was with blue helmets and blue turbans, and really had a wonderful lunch and discussion that I'll never forget, and we made plans for how to bring development together with peace and security. But, Sir, General Nambiar, you have led UN peacekeepers in some of the most complex situations. Ambassador was talking about how these situations get more and more complex with each and every year. But drawing on that, on your experience, what would you say to the points that the ambassador was raising? And how do you believe that, because we see peacekeeping is particularly under stress, right? From financing to the acceptability, let's say, of host governments and the multiplication of different actors, non-state actors and technology and things. But I think we all agree it's so much needed. What's the path forward in your view? Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Shombi. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I must make the point that I will speak on peacekeeping. Let me also try and speak on some other points. Also, for the simple reason, the reason why I say that is because a lot of you here I don't know, probably just a couple of people who probably were. Firstly, I'm in my 90th year. Okay, so I'm an antique. And therefore, when someone said about distinguished people, I'm an extinguished guy. But so, and you'll understand why I'm saying this, because what I have to say, only an extinguished guy would say, because you don't normally go around saying it otherwise. So let me start by, when that list of items that was set out about important achievements of the UN over the years. Believe me, when I sat down to look at it, I was astounded at what has been achieved by the UN. I didn't know it, actually. I started listing it out. And I think both Nitin and Ruchira have talked about it. And I can add quite a few more, to the list, but I don't want to sort of take your time. I think those of you who are interested will probably go back and look it up anyway. So let me then, in that context, like things like you have a chemical weapons treaty in place, you have the new non-proliferation treaty, you said law of the sea. There's so much around. So when I listed it out, I was shocked as to why the UN is in the state it is in now. That is what, of course, we've got to address ourselves. But one of the major, I think, features of, in terms of achievement is peacekeeping, obviously. And here, I just want to, for the benefit of those who are not aware of it, speak. My experience basically is as the first force commander and head of the United Nations forces in the former Yugoslavia. Now, that was in 1992-93. I set up that mission. Okay, and that is what, 33 years ago? So that's history now, but anyway, but it's a history worth looking back to, because it was the first mission, in context of what Ruchira just mentioned, where the United Nations peacekeepers were required to deal with intrastate dispute. It was, in fact, a unitary state breaking apart, and therefore the parties to the conflict fighting each other and all that. And that had its own repercussions. So the experiences from there came down the line. Now, why I mention this particular aspect of it is because I'm not now, you may wonder why I'm taking the liberty of speaking on things other than peacekeeping also. Because in later years, after I'd retired from the army, I was on the conference circuit, lecture circuit, moved around, saw the world, and did interact with a lot of people. And finally, this is about almost, I think, 20 years back, Kofi Annan picked on me to be a member of the Blue Ribbon panel that he had set up on threats, challenges, and change in 2003-04. I don't know whether any of you are aware of it or aware of the fact that I was on that panel, because the Indian government, of course, didn't have a clue what was happening. Kofi just asked me to join, and I joined. And I had the privilege of interacting with 4 former prime ministers across the world, 4 former foreign secretaries, a former national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to the senior Bush. Way back it was. So I had the privilege of interacting with them, and we went around the world talking to people. Now, this was in 2003, 2004, after the unilateral invasion of Iraq, or the when I say unilateral meaning, without the Security Council resolution. That's the context. But that's the context in which Kofi set it up. So I had the privilege of interacting at the international level to see what, here was going, here really. And one of the things which struck me as an infantryman with just under four decades in uniform and going out and interacting with these people was the hypocrisy of the international system, let me tell you. If we are in the state today, if the UN is in the state that it is today, it's one of the reasons is that. It has to be seen to be believed. The other, of course, there are a lot of reasons that one can go to, but to revert to the peacekeeping operation. Now, in that mission in Yugoslavia, as I said, it was the first where the UN was dealing with intrastate dispute, and I had contributions from 34 countries of the world under my command. 4 of the 5 permanent members had contributed to the mission. Yes, including the United States of America, not with combat troops, but they had a military hospital under my command in Zagreb. I had a Russian contingent, I had a huge French contingent, I had a significant contingent from the United Kingdom. Most of the countries of Europe had provided troops, and of course from the rest of the world, Africa, South America, Asia. I mean, it's another, something which I've always wondered about. I didn't have any troops from India. The reasons for that are different. You'll probably keep you till dinner if I try to explain all that. So it was just myself and my staff officer for my regiment, a major, whom I had. That was the Indian contribution at that time. Later, of course, civil police had joined the mission and all that. But why I'm mentioning this, this was probably the last mission where we had such a significant contribution from the developed world. All the former, Canadians, Australians, everyone was on board at that time. And I say this with feeling because peacekeeping is suffering today, which it shouldn't, not because the developed world is no longer contributing to UN peacekeeping. I mean, you'll be surprised. I was going through the list of contributions. I think we have Nepal, Rwanda, India, Bangladesh, and all top list. And when you come down the list, the first significant, if you can call it that, down in the 17th position was Italy with about 500-600 chaps somewhere sitting in Lebanon or wherever it is. Now that obviously has its own implications. Because the developed world, they are the ones with the capacity. And they are not participating. I mean, luckily, I'm proud to say that our Indian contingents do pretty well. They can match the best in the world. So we don't have to feel ashamed of ours. But the UN must have the equipment, resources. And once you have the boots on the ground, the countries will also provide the backing that's necessary. The political backing and the funding that you are talking about. That's absent because of this. Now, that's a sad state of affairs, and it hurts people like us practitioners that this has to happen. And I've made this point across the world. Many of my colleagues get upset when I mention this, but then they recognize that what I'm saying has a certain sense of validity if you want this institution to survive. Now, among other things about the peacekeeping, I'll make just 1 or 2 points. I think one of the things which I've always felt sad about is the fact that the United Nations has not exploited the mechanism of preventive deployment. I still recall, because that's my personal experience, President Gligorov of Macedonia requested Cyrus Vance, who was the Boutros Ghali's special envoy for Yugoslavia, for a UN, for the peacekeepers to be deployed in Macedonia. That trouble hadn't yet broken out in Macedonia, but he could see what's coming. And I was asked to examine that. I went across, I met President Gligorov and his things, and we had discussions, and we deployed peacekeepers in Macedonia. And that helped a lot because nothing happened really in Macedonia, unlike many of the other, Macedonia, Montenegro, all those places were ultimately saved from the from the sort of stuff that went on in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this is one of the things. There must be good reasons for it. The other thing I've always requested was a standing UN force to react to situations as they arrive. I mean, a Security Council passes a resolution for setting up a UN mission in so-and-so place. You talked of Mali or whatever. Mali, in any case, the peacekeepers should never have been deployed there, but that's another matter altogether. You have to have a certain, modicum of chance. In Yugoslavia, we barely had it, but we managed it, that sort of stuff. So a standing force for the UN. And I say this again because in the high-level panel, when we were going through our deliberations, I made this point, and while everyone nodded their heads and etc., Kofi said, look, these guys on top are never going to agree to this, what's the point sort of thing, it's not going to work, or whatever the reasons are. Because if the Security Council takes a decision, let's say today on the 30th of October, that a peacekeeping mission is to be deployed for a so-and-so, to deal with the situation in so-and-so country, the forces can only get together and it takes about 2-3 months. Now, by the 30th of March, the situation would have changed. It's no longer valid. That whole resolution has got no validity, if anything. So therefore, you have to have. Now, people are worried that it might become a standing army of the Secretary General. But that can't be deployed without the concurrence of the Security Council. Obviously, it'll cost money. But I think you think all this, what's going on, is not costing money. It's costing more money. The conflict that goes on is costing more money than would have been spent on peacekeeping if you had that. So these are the sort of things which need addressing. I don't know, I suppose we will deal with the other things as we go on, but insofar as peacekeeping is concerned, I thought I'd just make this intervention because I am proud of the fact that, incidentally, I have reason to be proud. I came back and I was a director, after my retirement, I was a director of an institution here in Delhi, a think tank, which I ran for 12.5 years after retirement. And in the process, I set up a Center for United Nations Peacekeeping, thanks to assistance from the Ministry of External Affairs. And my old batchmate from the academy was then the minister, Jaswant Singh. And George Fernandez was the defense minister. We managed to get around them. And they gave the support. And that center is flourishing. It's running courses for peacekeepers around the world. And on every course, we have 15 vacancies allotted to students from the developing world, from Africa, South America, and Asia. And the government of India puts their travel expenses, their stay, and food. Those youngsters have to only spend money on shopping. Now, I can't see too many countries across the world, giving this sort of a contribution. So that is why when I say I'm proud, I say I think India's contribution, people like us feel proud of. So when I go meet my maker, I go with great pleasure. Thank you.
This is on? Yeah. Thank you so much, General. I think that was really, really insightful and inspiring. You covered a lot. I'm glad that you not only peacekeeping, but also peacekeeping covered. And I think so many of your points really hit the nail on the head. The value for money, that it's so much more effective to invest in peacekeeping and prevention than the response. And people, I think, generally have this outlandish idea of the cost of peacekeeping. But if I'm not mistaken, the annual budget of the entire peacekeeping operations globally is something about, it's about the same as the annual budget of the New York City Police Department. So, as soon as we start to get this sense of, all of this money, no, in fact, it's real value for money. And India is definitely, you spoke about the support needed, of course, the men and women, but also the materials And I had the opportunity, I've had the opportunity to engage with the Center for UN Peacekeeping, and thank you so much for that, which was truly fantastic. And I've been able to speak out and participate. Also, where India is leading, again, bringing women into peace and security and offering these trainings for women from across the global south too. And I also had the opportunity to symbolically, on behalf of the UN Peacekeeping, receive 150 brand new armored personnel carriers from Bharat Forge. So, a wonderful element of Make in India and providing peacekeeping with state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line, safest equipment as well. So just wanted to mention that. This is perhaps now a good segue. So I have to say, despite your comments, you are clearly Jo Dil Se Young Hai. So very, very much young at heart, and that energy shines through so clearly. That's a nice segue to Priya, our youth voice here on the panel, because as I like to say, India has the greatest youth generation in history, more young minds to tap for solutions than ever before. So India did not create the problems that we face today. If we look at climate change, if we look at these sorts of things, young people did not create those challenges either. But unfortunately, it is the youth generation that will be dealing in the decades to come with the challenges that we face, from climate anxiety to the digital revolution, the pros and the cons of AI that we see changing every day. What, Priya, from your view, your perspective, how do you see, what's the pulse of young people's views on the United Nations, on multilateralism, and on the challenges we face, and how do we move forward? Over to you, Priya.
Thank you so much for the question. Am I audible? Yeah. So the question that you're talking about, how multilateralism is so important. Obviously, in a country, in a space and time where everybody is facing so many crises, we see so many countries facing the same crisis, and if you're working together, we'll be able to solve these issues. And if we talk about the youth's perspective, we believe that UN is doing a lot, but it needs to also include the young voices like us in the decision making and also in the way that decisions are made. And I feel like as we move forward, UN is doing a lot to make it more fruitful and effectful. But I also feel that there needs to be changes in the way it functions, because if we see about representation, I am a young woman, but I come from a particular community. I speak a certain language. That is why I'm here. We do not account for intersectionality, that we should have representation from different sects of the group, like women who speak a different language, women who come from a rural area, because whenever these decision makings are happening, we see a very less participation and less representation, which makes the decision making not inclusive of everybody. And the fact that it needs to, we need to work on climate change, we need to work on all the big issues, but there are also certain other issues. As you mentioned, like the digital world is evolving, AI is coming up there. So from my personal experience, I work with an organization called YP Foundation, where we work with adolescent students to make them aware about sexual health and well-being. In there, I feel like UN and other nations that are associated, like organizations that are associated with it, should diversify its scope and should make more programs to inculcate these issues also, because I know there are certain foundational issues that the world is working on, but with evolving time, there are new issues coming. With the digital AI, there's so many information available, and the adolescents, the young people like us who feel like, oh my God, there's so much, what should I believe, what should I not, and we don't really have that. And also, in order to move forward, just I mentioned, like, we need more representation, because I feel youth like us feel like there is this organization, it is working, but we feel we lack the representation. We feel it's not, I see people losing excitement about joining in the UN or being able to be there, because in order to be relevant in the future also, we need to adapt to the young people's need and to ensure that they are also there. Yeah, so all of these points would make it better.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Priya, and I think that the points are very well taken, and though I wouldn't say that we, speaking of the UN in particular, of course, the points that you've made are applicable to all institutions and voice for young people in decision making, and that's something we take to heart very much, and we are working on. In fact, this week we've had both the Assistant Secretary General for Youth, Philippe Pallier, here in town, learning from India's experiences in exactly these issues. We have Yuva, the Generation Unlimited, the India chapter of Yuva is the largest in the world. We've had a big conclave here as well, and Kevin Frey, the CEO of that from New York, is here also. So we've been listening a lot to what you and other young people are saying, and looking at how can we do better as an institution. And again, I think, but that goes for everybody, really. So thank you for that, Priya. I think now, mindful of the time, we wanted to be sure to have the opportunity to take any questions for the panelists. I didn't even say raise your hands yet, and already I see hands. So, you know, a moderator's greatest fear is always when you get to Q&A and there are no hands raised. So I see that's not an issue. So please, let's jump straight in there. You, sir. Oh, and I guess, yeah, we'll need a mic, please. Yeah, here. And please sort of state the question and who you specifically would best like to answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that there was a youth representative as well in the panel. I think it was really important. My question is mainly directed to Ms. Kamboj, since you spoke about resources, and it's directed as funding cuts. Given the deep funding cuts that UN is facing at the moment and the growing dependence on few member states, how realistic is it for the UN to explore models of self-funding? Can UN really explore that notion? Because, to put it bluntly, how long can moral authority coexist with financial subordination?
Thank you for that question. I must confess you've thrown me into a bit of a tizzy. What do you mean by self-financing? Could you explain that? Because as you know, the UN is funded by member states.
That's right.
Either assessed contributions or voluntary contributions. Right. And sometimes you get donations from the foundations, etc., etc. So what is self-funding?
So when we talk about reform, right, so I was wondering if there are ways that we can explore, like UN can explore to earn by itself. I mean, it's controversial, but perhaps global taxation mechanisms. Or even, something as small as citizen-based contribution, which would be more like a subscription-based model, like, Netflix for humanity. I mean, these are just thoughts that I have been thinking, right. But I see that there's a problem of resources, and unless an institution cannot fund itself, it will not have the authority, is what I believe. So I just wanted to understand how realistic it is to even imagine it, because it will definitely need political consensus across member states. But I just thought...
Yeah. No, I think that's great creativity. And I think this is the kind of creativity that we need in times of crisis. Look, the UN has a huge budget. To run the kind of systems that it does, you need a huge budget. And therefore, it is absolutely mandatory that each member state must contribute to the United Nations. You know what is the problem? The problem is that today, as of today, member states are not contributing at all, or in time, or in full. Now, how on earth can an organization run without that kind of funding support? Therefore, UN80, the reforms are more about, financial reform. And there's a development crisis in the United Nations because you don't have the funds. So I'm afraid whichever way you look at it, and I really admire your creativity, I would say the member states must contribute because the member states have joined up to form this system. And there is a scale of assessment within the UN system whereby each member state is mandated to contribute. Over and above, there is a system of voluntary contributions, but that's voluntary. There is an assessed peacekeeping budget, and member states must contribute to that budget, because without resources, all of us here agree, without resources, without financing a steady stream, how can you run peacekeeping missions? How can you run humanitarian organizations? It's impossible. So it's fantastic what you're suggesting, that maybe citizens can contribute, if I understood you correctly, and so forth. But that will just be a little trickle, I'm afraid. Member states must contribute according to a sliding scale that has been approved and accepted at the United Nations. And that is the bottom line. And that is why I said two things must happen in the UN if, it has to reform. One is definitely mandates must, resources must match mandates. And I would fund more smartly, which is that I would fund not when an emergency arises, because the UN bureaucracy is at the end of the day a bureaucracy. My apologies. Bureaucracies don't work very fast. So why don't you create a system, a trigger within the system that just as the crisis occurs, you are ready with the funding. So I think it's great creativity, congratulations, but there is no substitute. Even if the private sector funds, even if the foundations fund, there is no substitute for member states' contribution to the United Nations system.
I just wanted to add one interesting story to what it's a member states who have to contribute. Around the end of the 90s, the United States stepped back. And from what it was due to them, they've got a couple of $100 million they refused to pay. And there was Ted Turner who said, I don't care, I'll write the check. And Ted Turner gave the check, which should have been paid by the US government. And at my insistence, we put a little painting or a picture of it on the wall of the UN. I hope it's still there. This was possibly around the late 90s. The picture is in the place where there are, not in the main building, but in the building opposite. And I hope it's there, but I don't know, I've been out too long. But I just thought I'd let you know that there are people who will take care of the UN, even if the governments don't.
Thank you. I think really, really good points. And just to say clearly, we need that core member states, member states stepping up to the obligations. And then at different levels, we engage with private sector, we engage with, because it's about trying to get issues of sustainability and inclusion into core business models and this sort of thing, absolutely. Whole of society type of approach. I see we're going to have many more questions and we'll probably have time to take on board. But I think, why don't we just, I'm continuing here in a line just right in front. Okay, well, yeah, here, and then we'll move right back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellencies. It was so enlightening.
And please introduce yourself.
My question is, I'm A.K. Merchant. I'm with the Baha'i community as well as the Temple of Understanding, an interfaith platform. My concern is the Agenda 2030. You have made reference to the series of conferences in the 1990s, starting with the World Summit of Children in New York, and then with the Food and Agriculture, then the Millennium Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals. It was much more participatory than all the previous discussions and conferences and summits. But today, our Secretary General of the UN is lamenting every message that comes. Nobody is funding the SDGs, and we need at least $2 trillion per annum. Will humanity ever be able to wake up? I mean, they are all signatories, and it was so much more participatory. What is the way out? We have less than 5 years now to fulfill our SDG goals. But most countries are, as the Secretary General has pointed out, lagging behind, and they have funds for fighting wars, conflicts, and all kinds of other negative things, but nothing for this positive and welfare of the entire human race. So if you have any comments, how the SDGs are going to move forward, sir.
Thank you. Particular and a bit related, I
Well,
think, to the previous.
Perhaps Ambassador.
Okay, why don't we'll take a few.
Kamboj, please.
Okay, why don't we'll take a couple of questions, just to be sure we get, and then, yeah, so just behind, just behind, oh. Okay, why not? Both ladies right here, yeah. Do you have a question? Please, yeah, and just.
Okay, you
who
want
you
my
are?
name first? I'm Peggy Mohan. I'm a linguist and writer. I just wanted to point to something that Nitin said about a town hall meeting type model, that is what the UN is. I think we have reached an inflection point which is being alluded to but not played up sufficiently, that we're talking of futures and you have two things going on: the multilateral way of getting participation from everyone, and a future world which is much more monolithic and corporate. And the corporates don't have a multilateral approach to what are the problems. They are on their own trip. So you are confronting a world where the resources are going to be completely captured by a corporate sector, and you're trying to act as though it is business as usual, that you can mandate that states which no longer have money should give. I mean, there has been a change, and you're in the cusp of a very strange new era. We don't know how it's going to play out. I'm hoping it's not a successful change to our corporate culture where AI, which represents a corporate view of how the world is to be regulated, as opposed to the UN multilateral approach where everyone has a place. Now, I think you've all been talking around this and not saying it straight away. You're on the edge of the future. When you jump into the future, you're in probabilistic space. You don't know how it's going to play out. But clearly there is this conflict above and beyond conflicts between nations, between the corporate vision and what was the UN vision.
Thank you. And I think, panelists, with your permission, what I think, because mindful of the time, we'll take a few more questions, and then really I'll just give each of you a chance to respond as you feel relevant before we wrap up, if that's all right. Yes, let's go a little bit here in the back.
Can I just, since the mic is in my hand, may I? So my question is to General Nambiar, jo shareer aur dil mein jawan hai. So you had talked about the permanent peacekeeping force, the standing peacekeeping force. You also spoke of the preventive deployment. So I want to hear a little bit more about what you see as the size of the standing force, what kind of weapons, what kind of structures, and what would be its relationship with the preventive deployment. Would the preventive deployment force draw on the standing force? Is it a separate thing, etc.? And roughly what would the budgets be?
Thank you. Okay, in the sort of mustard color there, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Raghuvansh Sinha, independent journalist, formerly with the Hindustan Times. I want to take forward the point Mr. Nitin Desai was making, that United Nations should reflect the voice of the powerful as well as the most members. Now, I remember 1995 when it was 50 years of United Nations. Even at that time, people used to say, when will we have a woman Secretary General? Even today, we have not had a woman Secretary General. How will the voice of 50% of the population be reflected if we don't have a representation? And the second point is, what we have seen over the years is that the Secretary General is not reflecting the voice of everyone, simply because sometime a perception is there that he's jockeying for a second term. Now, except for Boutros Ghali, everyone gets a second term. Should it be that only one term for a Secretary General and no Secretary? So he can be more free, he can be more brave to stand up against the powerful in the big nations.
And that's he or she. Yes, good points. Thank you. Okay, I think perhaps we'll just take 3 more quick questions, and then we come to the panel for sort of reactions and final thoughts. Just since the microphone is there in the back, yeah, and then we'll come forward.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody.
Please.
I'm Shikha. I retired from UNICEF Delhi. And my question is, if the UN's founding vision was peace after war, what is its moral vision today? Is it survival, sustainability, or solidarity?
Thank you. Okay, and I see the anguish. So okay,
here.
let's go over here, ma'am, and then we'll come here to the front to wrap up in the pink.
Thank you, panel. I'm Poonam Dabas, basically a journalist turned a bureaucrat. The panel has very beautifully reflected at UN at 80. My apprehension is about the vision for the future. Last night I was watching a very beautiful documentary, The Dirty Sky. You know, the debris, the traffic jams in space. Earlier it was just the governments who were responsible for it. Now it is the private players. So I just want the UN also to have a little futuristic, view on this. By 2045 or 2050, there'll be no place left for further satellites. And so much of our modern life depends on that, from communication to all kinds of information. So I would like you to reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I think we were just
We have
down
one
here.
gentleman here.
Second row. Oh, okay, actually, sorry. Yeah, the microphone is already over here. Yeah, please, sir.
My apologies. I can't stand up because of physical limitation. I am here accidentally. I had a meeting in IIC library. That's why I came. But when I met you, that there is a UN meeting, I excused myself from the meeting to attend. We are trained to speak only for 3 minutes in UN, not more than any intervention. I will like to tell you, I have gone through 4 hells. Private sector, senior servant in Government of India, principal advisor in UN, and NGO chief. My experience has been that UN has been doing fairly good work. Certainly, I had been to 130 countries while working in Government of India and UN. I have seen poverty levels, how they have been lifted by the World Food Program. I have seen WHO, what sort of services WHO has provided. I have seen a number of those areas. So UN has to be seen as a helping. Don't go by what goes in New York, because that is a talking shop. Much of the activities are in the field, and some of the agencies have contributed that. Thank you very much. My 3 minutes are over.
Thank you, sir. Very powerful indeed. So we will now wrap up here in these second row, third row, please.
Yeah, as a layman, I have a couple of negatives at the top of my mind. We started with talking about...
And you are, sir?
My name is Bagai. As a layman, I have a couple of negatives. You started out by talking about the gray skies. Well, that's one reason why I'm wearing a mask. And I feel that at least Delhi and maybe our country has been a miserable failure in control of emissions, although we talk so much about it. And second point is, what has India gained by being so reluctant to call out Israel for its genocide in Gaza? What has world peace gained by that? What has world gained? Thank you.
Please,
Am I audible?
last question, please.
Okay. Sir, my name is Sakshi Rani and I'm simply a student from IGNOU. My question is that we always hear that that we need reform in the UNSC. But what is the factor that UNSC is not reforming? My question is to the Sir Nitin sir.
Thank you, thank you. I think what I will do now, again, mindful of the time, I'll just ask each of our panelists to respond. You won't be able to respond to all the questions for sure, but any question you feel most relevant and any final thoughts that you have, and I'll start with USG.
Very quickly, see, one of the things about multilateralism is that is certainly under threat in many ways. But one remarkable feature of what we see in the UN is it has provided a space for the plurilaterals to come together. Let me give you two quick examples. One was, there was a proposal for an anti-personnel landmines treaty. And there are a lot of people who opposed to it. But Canada took it up and got a whole lot of people to join with them. And yes, it's not a UN treaty, but it is a treaty which was inspired by the UN. The second one, the International Criminal Court, ICC, which Italy proposed. Again, it was opposed in the UN on a multilateral basis. But UN facilitated a plurilateral get-together of a very large number of countries, not just 2 or 3 or 4, but a very large number of countries who are part of the ICC. So one, remember this, that like a town hall, when you bring people together, if you don't get a unanimous agreement, the town hall still provides a space for those who agree to come together on something. That's one thing. Second, the other thing that has happened is the extent to which the UN has engaged with non-governmental organizations and how large a number of them are now participating in all of the UN conferences and influencing it. Not only that, I believe the UN has also inspired the internationalization of many NGOs. Third, you mentioned the whole issue of the private sector. That was Kofi Annan was very focused on that. And he has set up a unit of private sector companies. And you can see, for instance, in UNFCCC, how we are actually getting more mileage out of the corporate sector than we are getting out of governments. So yes, you're absolutely right. You will have to recognize this reality that the effective power of implementation at the ground level is not entirely with governments, that this is one remarkable feature of the UN. I described it as a town hall meeting, but it also has NGOs and now increasingly corporations who are getting quite involved in the process. So my thought is that essentially what we are seeing is a transformation of the UN into something which reflects a little bit more the way in which the world itself is changing in the nature of relationships between people. But let me stop here. I'm sure my colleagues have much more to say.
Thank you so much. Ambassador.
Thank you. I'll take up 4 quick points very quickly. To the excellent point that you made about the SDGs and the funds, I think you're absolutely right. I think this money should be directed to the SDGs, particularly since they are miserably off right now. But let me tell you, the SG was very clear in 2023, just before the SDG summit of 2023, that you need to inject $500 billion annually as a stimulus to help the developing countries reach the SDGs, which were badly off track. It's another matter that didn't really happen. But very recently in Spain, you had the Financing for Development Conference. And there, I think there was more serious thought given to funding for the SDGs, including expanding the capacity of the multilateral financial institutions to extend help to the smaller states. Also, that something has to be done for indebted states because they don't have the money. Let me give you a very simple fact. The indebted states are so busy paying off their loans and interest, there is no fiscal space left for the SDGs. So it was agreed at the FFD conference that something would be done under UN auspices. And of course, certainly, there was agreement also that the private sector needs to be involved more closely as far as the funding of the SDGs is concerned, because let's be honest, most of the money, 80% of the money is with the private sector. So I think these were ideas and suggestions. As they say, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. So let us see what will happen. But I think certainly people are thinking of ways and means so as to move this juggernaut forward. I think a young lady there asked a very interesting question. Very quickly, I'll answer that. Why is Security Council reform not happening when it's very evident that it should happen? Well, simply, I can give you a very long answer, but the short answer is because it potentially upsets the balance of power that was so carefully crafted in 1945. Every country looks at it from their perspective. Every country has a certain point of view, and no country would like an expansion whereby the other country gets in and you don't. So it potentially impacts the balance of power. To your question about the Secretary General, should we have one term or should we have 2 terms? I don't think this is the best way to look at the problem. That's my own personal view. What I think is that there have been instances in the past when Secretaries General have got into airplanes and entered conflict zones and discussed the way out with the leaders in question. But what happens if a Secretary General is declared a persona non grata? How can he then advance the peace process? And I think all Secretary Generals are very dedicated to the cause and are trying to keep the peace. It is just that member states, that was my first point. The UN is nothing but a confab of member states. And if member states don't cooperate, the Secretary General or the Secretariat is nothing. Everything is member state driven, trust me. And that is the politics of the United Nations. So I'll pass on the...
Please, thank you, Ambassador General.
Thank you very much. I'll just firstly address the direct question you asked about this standing force and preventive deployment. Now, standing force, the least should be about a brigade strength, that's about 2,000-3,000 soldiers. Not talking of any big equipment, just a standard personal weapons and things like that, properly structured like a brigade. And my suggestion has always been, it must comprise volunteers from member countries. Volunteers, and obviously the country has to agree to send them, and they'll go there as individuals, not representing the country. And you form this composite force, equip them, train them. And then the biggest point I make is probably, it may not go down too well with everyone in this room and otherwise, that they should not become gladiators. They must be on a 2-year or 3-year contract. That's it. And at that end, they must revert to their home countries and be replaced by others. Otherwise, you become, they're there for eternity and will be no use to man or beast. Now, the purpose of this force is, when a decision is taken for deployment, as I mentioned, the situation is ripe, the parties to the conflict have agreed to a ceasefire and things like that, so you must deploy quickly. And because a force of even 3,000 deployed quickly, in time, can do much more than a force of 10,000 going in 3 months later. You don't require, what is it called? The people talk of any rocket science, knowledge of rocket science to realize that. That's the added advantage, if and when people come to terms with this effectiveness or the scope for preventive deployment being, very useful, this force provides the capacity. Because basically, when I talk of this force, you must remember, it is deployed quickly, but in the meanwhile, the UN goes through its normal procedures, puts together a force which goes and replaces them, and then these guys revert to what do you call standby or whatever. That's the basic concept. I mean, in very brief, I'm now trying to tell you. So that's a force that's available. It makes sense to us as soldiers and people who have been practitioners, but it obviously has costs. But as I said, none of these things those costs will probably be less than what we are otherwise incurring. Anyway, a couple of points have been made about this vision for the future, reform and all that. As I said, I was a member of the Security Council, of that high-level panel which made recommendations about Security Council. No one contests the fact that the Security Council needs reform, because in its present form, it's an antique. Something like me, I said I am, but it's outdated. It's no longer. But they all can't agree on the mechanisms. So, and to be quite frank, I'll tell you, as I said, I can say these things now. none of the permanent five want change there. This is my impression, and my colleagues also gather, they don't want. The Americans are, in fact, they probably are not happy with the present strength of the Security Council. They would be happier to see easier to get a smaller group to agree, so you get more fellows on board or something like that. The the Brits and the French are not too sure about their own positions on an enlarged Security Council. The Chinese are happy with the present position because they are sole representatives of the developing world, as it were. So they were. The Russians, at that time, of course, they were not too sure about the world. I think the Russians deserve a place. They'll probably remain there. So none of them want to change. They'll come yelling to Delhi and say, oh, we support your seat for... They know fully well that nothing's going to happen, at least not in there. And I said this in 2000, and we submitted our report on the 31st of December, 2004. And I recall being asked about this when I came back. I've written to it. I mentioned to many of my Ruchira's colleagues whom I knew, I said, nothing's going to happen, so don't hit your head against the wall. They're all yelling about India must get a place on it. I said, you get your economic act together, make sure that your people's education, economic well-being, health and sanitation looked after, and you won't have to yell for India to get a place. Others will espouse your cause. That's the sort of thing. And similarly, it's not so much our place. The Africans, 54 or 55 countries, unrepresented in the permanent category. How can you call that a legitimate decision-making body? South America, 22 or 28 or whatever, unrepresented in the permanent. They must have a voice in the permanent category. Because otherwise no one bothers in any case. And the veto thing is outdated anyway. It should have gone away long ago. That's another subject altogether. So it needs reform. I said then in 2004 as well, I said then in my lifetime it's not going to happen. Now that's 21 years back, and I've got not very much longer to go. I don't think it's going to happen now. I don't know whether you will see it, Ruchira, but we can only hope you do. The other thing was about as far as the UN is concerned, is credibility. I think one of the things that it requires the bureaucracy, it needs an overhaul. Anyone who says it doesn't, has got to go, I think, his or her head examined. It does need it. And I'll give you a simple example. In my lectures, days of lecturing, I used to give this thing when people asked me, I said about the UN bureaucracy. So I used to give this simile. I said, look, before I went off to head this force in Yugoslavia, I was the Director General of Military Operations, incidentally, at that time. And I'd dealt with the stuff here and the bureaucracy in India at that sort of a level. And I went with this abiding impression that the Indian civilian bureaucracy was the worst in the world. That was my, that's what most of us, we army men think so, but that's not. But when I came back from from that assignment after exactly a year, I came back with a healthy respect for our bureaucracy. That's how much the UN bureaucracy needs overhauling. So that's the thing. The last point I'll make is about, you mentioned this point of multilateralism. This is a talk of multilateralism going on along. In my view, which I've expressed at various fora, multilateralism, at least America's commitment to multilateralism, which I think is more important than anyone else's, died with the presidency of the senior Bush. That was in January 1992. Since January 1992, America is not, there's no multilateralism. They're not committed to any multilateralism. Every single action has been unilateral. That's what my view is, and it'll remain that way. They have the power, they'll exercise it. So whether things will come around, multilateralism, yeah, we can make all those noises, but they'll remain squeaks, which not much happening. But somewhere things have got to change, I presume. And we can all pray for that to happen. That's the best I can say at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nobody asked.
Last but not least.
So I can't really say anything.
That's okay. That's the vision for the future.
I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, dear colleagues, a round of applause for the panelists. I think we've heard incredibly clear messages. that multilateralism, the UN, of course, very much needs to reform and change and adapt, and the UN is very much focused on that to some degree, though I think it was Shashi Tharoor who said the UN is both an actor and a stage, but it only becomes an actor when the member states on the stage agree, and I think that was also important. So let's also keep member states accountable for the reforms that need to happen. And I think that it's very clear that India has always been, and again, more than ever, is such an incredibly important pillar in both pushing the reforms that are needed and in safeguarding that which the UN is doing, and we've also heard very clearly is so very, very important, and it's down to saving lives each and every day across the world. Also, there's the famous quote, Madeleine Albright, I think, if it didn't exist, we would need to invent it. And then we also heard from Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister of India, on Friday, that however difficult, the commitment to multilateralism must remain strong. And for all of its imperfections, the UN must be supported in this time of crisis. So from the UN system here, the colleagues here, for that, we do say, Hum Bharat ko dil se dhanyavad kehte hain. A deep thanks to India for the role that you have played, you are playing, and will play. And then finally, on a personal note, as I said on Friday, it is the end of my innings here in India. Personally, it's been incredible innings, 4 years. But, the show must go on. I have to give space to the next resident coordinator coming. But as I've said before, really, truly, deeply, Bharat ki mere dil mein hamesha khas jaga rahegi. I will always keep a big part in my heart for India, and I will be back as early and often as possible. Thank you so very much, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think, Shombi, you had a little memento you were hoping to share with the panelists.
Yes. Please. Now, of course, in India, we like to facilitate our guests. So please, if I can ask the panelists to come to the front. This is a very small token of appreciation. This is the one you were looking for. The India. Yes. Wonderful. The India UN Friendship Pin. On this beautiful. And of course, General. It's always a little bit precarious pinning something on a general's because used to having so many, I know. There we are. Thank you. And of course. Excellent. Thank you so much.